Good evening. Thank you so much for coming out to our Good Friday service tonight. In just a few moments, we're going to receive communion together. And so if this is something you're not accustomed to, let me provide you with a little bit of direction. First of all, communion here at Curtis Lake is open to everybody. You don't have to be a member. You don't have to have gone through a class or anything like that, so you're welcome to participate. And so when it's time, I'll invite you to come and come forward, and each of these three tables in the front here will have people serving crackers and juice. If you have any concerns, the juice is simply that, it's juice. The crackers are gluten-free, so everybody is hopefully able to participate. I just want to read one of the accounts for why we even do this, like where this came from. Many of you, I'm sure, are probably familiar with it, but some of you might not be. The context in which this kind of memorial was established was the context of the Last Supper. You probably heard of that, where Jesus, prior to the crucifixion, he was at dinner celebrating the Passover with his disciples. And then we kind of pick up on the story here. I'd just like to read that and make a few comments to talk about the symbols, because that's exactly what these are. We're gonna receive a cracker and a cup of juice, and these are symbols that represent. First of all, the cracker represents Jesus' body, and the juice represents his blood. So in Matthew chapter 26, this is Matthew's account of the Last Supper. It says, as they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed it, and broke it, gave it to the disciples, and said, take and eat it. This is my body. So this Passover feast, this high kind of holy day that they were celebrating, something that they had done for their entire lives. Every single year they celebrated this day, perhaps the most important of all the holidays. And so here they're, again, just kind of going through the same routine. It's a little different, though. By this point, things are really escalating in terms of both the people that are kind of getting eager about whatever Jesus means. This past Sunday, we had Palm Sunday. Right, and so Palm Sunday was, for some, the initiation of this revolution that they were expecting to take place. Right, so there are all kinds of people thinking possibly Jesus was this messianic revolutionary that was going to free them from the tyranny of Rome. But Jesus also had his share of enemies. Right, many people were very threatened by Jesus' teaching. By the growing popularity that he was experiencing among the kind of the lowly part of society. And so anyway, they're here, they're having dinner, and Jesus interrupts sort of the regular customary sequence of the meal. And this time does something he's never done before, at least as far as we know. He takes this bread and he breaks it into pieces and he distributes it to each of his disciples that were there. And he said, this bread represents my body, which is broken for you. At this point, they probably really had no real understanding or idea what the significance of that was. We find oftentimes in the Gospels, Jesus will say something and the disciples they're like you and I, just utterly confused, right? But also, as confused as they are, also a little nervous, a little cowardly in asking Jesus for some clarification. And so perhaps that's kind of what was going on here as Jesus said, this represents my body, which is broken for you. I imagine many at the table there were like, okay, hey, just another Jesus-ism, right, that we're going to have to be comfortable with. But Jesus really meant this, right? And so even today, when you come forward, you're gonna get a piece of a cracker. I hope none of you are hungry, right? Like, I'll just be honest. If you thought this was gonna nourish you, fill you up, make you feel less, hunger pains, it's just a piece of a cracker. That's it. But it is broken. unless you get really lucky. But no. The cracker is broken. It's a fragment of a piece. And Jesus says this represents my body. It's symbolic, right? The broken bread is symbolic of the body that was going to be broken for a very specific purpose. And I think that brokenness is also something that we can relate to our own lives as well. Right? The reality that you and I, we live in brokenness. We live in unwholeness. Like we all recognize there are areas of our lives. Perhaps you might feel like my entire life is just broken. We live in a broken world, right? And so the symbolism of this broken cracker can be very, very meaningful to us, even in our present circumstances. Jesus said to each of them, take it and eat it, right? And so they actually consumed this piece of bread. And I think that gesture carries with it some sense of intimacy, right? They again, it wasn't for the purpose of nourishing, at least their physical part of who they were, right? It did really nothing for them as far as that is concerned. But by taking in this symbol of Jesus' broken body, there was this shared intimacy that they would be able to experience to some extent at that point. But then we find this became a customary tradition within the church. Like whenever people who were following Jesus, whenever they gathered together, whenever they worshiped, they would do this. At some point, most oftentimes they were sharing a meal as part of their worship observance. And in that meal, somebody break the bread into pieces. Say, remember Jesus on the cross. Remember that body that was broken for us. And so we do that again today, even, 2,000 years later, we look at the symbol of what that means. Now, I want to point out, perhaps even encourage you, that this can be taken in one of several ways. This could be a relatively sterile, kind of static thing that you do. If you participate, if you come forward and you take the cracker and the juice, you can. It could carry very little significance for you, or it could carry great significance. And I just want to encourage you to consider the weight of what this means, of what this symbolizes for us, because you can stand off of our, like from a standpoint of like your position. You can observe the brokenness of the cross from a distance, like many people did. When Jesus literally died on the cross, there were those that observed from a distance. And there were also those, who could be described as being there at the foot of the cross, mourning and grieving the suffering that Jesus was going through. For whatever reason he happened to be going through it. For them, it was very unclear, but for us, it's very clear. Jesus suffered in place of us. He suffered so that we wouldn't have to suffer in the same way. He suffered so that we wouldn't have to ultimately suffer the fate of being just eternally separated from God and living without any hope, living without the possibility that it could be better, living without the possibility that what is broken could ever be mended, that what is bruised could ever be healed. And so the broken body of Jesus represents exactly that for us, the hope that we have because of what he did. And so rather than standing afar as this observer, just kind of looking from a distance at the brokenness of the cross, we can instead accept the invitation to become one with the brokenness, to recognize and understand and feel even our own brokenness. Our brokenness, which has led to suffering, our own suffering, right? Our own experiences of suffering, and also the suffering that this world experiences because of the problem of sin. In the story, it says, then he took a cup. So after he had given the bread to each and they had eaten, then he took a cup, right? And this is, again, symbolized by the cup that we're going to receive in a few moments. He took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, and he said, drink from it, all of you. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. And so like the broken cracker represents the broken body of Jesus, so this cup represents his blood. And you say, well, why is that important? And we sang a lot about that tonight. A lot of the songs contain lyrics relating to the blood of Jesus, which, in our 2022 contemporary mindsets is a little difficult for us to really make a connection with. But many of you are familiar with what it was like in Jesus' day, where it was really bloody. That the way you dealt with the brokenness of humanity, the way you dealt with sin, the way you dealt with the mistreatment that we inflict upon one another, the way you dealt with all of that mess, the way you dealt with this chasm that separates a person from God, the way you dealt with it was with sacrifice. Many sacrifices, sacrifice after sacrifice. I mean, it was just a bloody, bloody scene, right? And this was done over and over and over and over again by everybody. Like, if you wanted to be right with God, you had to provide a sacrifice, right? And the sacrifice symbolized a kind of substitute that, like, just sort of covered over the brokenness of our lives, the sin of our lives, and that helped us to kind of reestablish that connection with the Father. But even in that, sacrificial system is very imperfect, obviously. We know it was imperfect because you had to keep on doing it over and over again. It's not like you just, once brought your sacrifice and, like, that was it. That was the end. And so the difference between what Jesus accomplished on the cross, which put an end to all that. How many of you are glad you didn't have to bring a bull church with you tonight, right? That's a good thing, right? Nobody's got to bring a little lamb to church on Sunday morning, right? Why? Because what Jesus accomplished replaced all that. And so he says this cup, this cup of wine that they all drank from, it represents my blood, the blood of the covenant, right? This covenant, this relational promise that he's making between him and each of us, to his disciples, of course, but by extension to each of us as well. This covenant that now exists between us and the Father, where kind of like what we sang about, I don't have to do anything to earn God's favor. I don't have to do anything to, force my way into. I don't have to live with the hope that, well, maybe I could be good enough. Like, I don't know how good enough is, but whatever that mark is, hopefully I hit it and hopefully God accepts me. No, like, we literally bring nothing to God. He simply extends his love to us. He gives us mercy in the place of the judgment that we deserve. He gives us grace and strength and power to live differently than we ever thought possible, and it's through this covenant that he has established with us. Now, interestingly, after this dinner, and they cleaned up, the Bible says that they went out, and so now they're together, and Jesus said this to them: "Tonight, all of you will fall away because of me. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered." So Jesus, after this wonderful, beautiful moment that they had, Jesus now with the disciples, having left the house, and this is kind of approaching moments before he's about to be arrested and ultimately tried and led to the cross. Jesus says to them, tonight, right now, tonight, after all this, all of you will fall away because of me. And Peter, Peter told him, even if everyone falls away because of you, I will never fall away. I mean, Peter was that type of guy. Of course, he'd say something like that. And you know what? I believe Peter really meant it. I believe he meant it with all of his heart. Jesus, it doesn't matter what happens. It doesn't matter what we go through. I am going to be there. Jesus, between you and me, these guys, I get it. These guys are weak. Right? Like when the going gets tough, they'll get going. I know, but not me, Jesus, right? Peter, he's out there. And I believe he really believed no matter what happened, he'd be there by Jesus' side. But Jesus said, truly, I tell you, Tonight, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter argues with Jesus. Even if I have to die with you, Peter told him, which he wasn't expecting was going to happen. Like, let's be honest. Peter was expecting something far more amazing than Jesus dying on a cross. He says, even if I have to die with you, Peter told him, I will never deny you. And then all the disciples said the same thing. It's like Peter's the head cheerleader here, and everybody is just now rah, rah, rah. Yes, Jesus, we're with you to the end. I don't know about you. That's a pretty bold statement, right? You start arguing with Jesus. You'd think that they had learned by this point of time in their lives, don't argue with Jesus. Can you imagine? Can you imagine arguing with Jesus? Like Jesus says, you're going to do this. You're like, not me, Jesus. You probably can't imagine it, and yet isn't that exactly what we do? Isn't that exactly a great way to describe our life? How the various ways in which we argue with Jesus. We argue with him regarding what should be the priorities of our lives. We argue with him about what should really be at the center of our lives. Like we oftentimes go very, very far from what he wants for us. And so what we come here today, we gather around, so to speak, we gather around this table together. Everyone on very equal footing, right? There's not one here who is greater than another. There's not one here who, like within our own selves, is more righteous than another. It might feel that way. It might feel like there's all kinds of people that are better than you. It might feel like there's all kinds of people that are worse than you. But the reality is we are all here, equally sharing in the suffering that we experience and that we cause. And so tonight I want us to be reminded of where we would be without him. We're not going to read this part of the story, but the story goes on exactly how Jesus described it. Jesus is arrested and they're gone. Jesus is tried, and Peter, sure enough, 3 times denies that he even knows Jesus. And through that, we are reminded of where we would be without him. We'd be just like they were, lost, confused, scared, unable to face what needed to be faced. But I also want you to imagine where you could be with Jesus. Imagine where you could be if you really, you didn't just eat the cracker and just drink the juice, but like you really invited into your life the reality of what those symbols represent. If we really did that, if we really came to be with Jesus, like what would that mean? What significance could that have in our lives? I'd suggest a few things. Number one, the things that we've ruined. Any of you ever ruin anything? like you just ruined something in your life, like ruined something that was good. You just ruined it. You're like, I don't know how I did that. I don't know why I did that, right? But the reality is we ruin things all the time. But what we've ruined, he can restore, right? Any of you feel broken tonight? Just broken. Where we're broken, Jesus can heal. This is where we could be with him. Like we're lost without him. We're scattered, left to our own devices. We are a mess. Really hot mess. But with him, he can heal what's broken. The load that we may be carrying tonight, if you're here tonight and there's just like this burden, this load that you've been carrying for a day or two or months or years, just carrying this burden with you. And you feel the weight and the pressure of that thing just constantly holding you down, constantly keeping you back. If you're willing to go with Jesus, he can relieve the burden and the pressure that comes with it. Jesus can take what is hopeless, what is impossible, and he can do the miraculous.